It was just another typical day, and I was enjoying a peaceful afternoon in my front yard, wearing my favorite MAGA hat. But that peace was shattered when Karen, the neighborhood HOA president, spotted me from across the street. She immediately stormed over to my house, outraged by my choice of headgear. Without even trying to talk to me first, she called 911, claiming I was causing a disturbance and making the neighborhood unsafe. I couldn't believe it. This woman was so triggered by a hat that she was willing to involve the police. But what Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just any resident. I had a plan to make her regret her overreaction. Stay to the end to see how I destroyed her. Although Karen had a plan, she wasn't so lucky in the end. Unlike the people who subscribe to this channel, they get 5 years of luck. Anyway, let's continue. It was an unusually warm afternoon, and I decided to spend a few hours outside getting some fresh air. My MAGA hat was my go-to accessory when I spent time outdoors, not just because I supported the cause, but because it was comfortable and, honestly, I liked the look. I had never gotten any complaints before, and my neighbors had always seemed to mind their business, so I figured I'd be just fine. Little did I know today would be different. I was in the front yard, trimming the bushes when I noticed Karen walking briskly down the sidewalk, holding her clipboard with that signature, self-righteous expression. She was always walking around, making sure the neighborhood was up to her standards, so when she spotted me, I figured she'd do what she usually did, take notes about someone's lawn or the right shade of paint on a fence. But this time, she didn't just look at my yard. Her eyes locked onto my MAGA hat, and her expression changed. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Without even saying hello, she marched up to me, her heels clicking aggressively on the sidewalk, and said, "That hat is offensive to this community." I raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? You can't just wear that in public around here. It's divisive and makes everyone uncomfortable," she continued, her face red with anger. I wasn't sure if I was hearing her correctly. Was she really trying to tell me what I could and couldn't wear in my own yard? The conversation quickly went from strange to absurd. "Karen, I'm not breaking any rules. This is my property, and I can wear what I like," I said, trying to remain calm. But I could already tell she wasn't listening. She crossed her arms and scowled at me. "This neighborhood isn't a place for that kind of political statement. You need to take that hat off." I stood my ground. "No, I don't think I will," I replied, a little more firmly than I intended. "I'm just enjoying my afternoon, Karen. No one here is being harmed by my hat." But she wasn't done. In a snap, Karen reached for her phone and dialed 911. "I'm calling the police," she said. "I'm reporting you for making the neighborhood unsafe with that hat. I don't feel safe, and I'm sure others don't either." I was stunned. 911 for wearing a hat. I stood there staring at her as she continued to talk to the operator, telling them that I was acting aggressively because of my political affiliation. I couldn't believe it. But while she was on the phone, I realized something. This wasn't just a random complaint. Karen had been on a power trip for years, using her position as HOA president to push people around and control how the neighborhood functioned. And now she was using the police to try and silence me. "Karen, this is ridiculous," I said, still trying to make sense of the situation. "You're calling the police over a hat? That's insane." But she wasn't hearing me. "I'm doing this for the safety of the community," she insisted, completely ignoring the absurdity of the situation. As I waited for the police to arrive, I realized one thing. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I wasn't about to just let her bully me into submission because she didn't like my political views. I had to fight back, not just for my rights, but for everyone else in the neighborhood who might eventually feel the same pressure. But the question was, how? As the seconds ticked by, I could see Karen standing there on the phone, her face flushed with indignation. She was so wrapped up in her righteous anger that she didn't even notice I was recording the whole interaction. I wasn't sure what she was telling the operator, but I could clearly see how she was twisting the narrative. Every word she said was exaggerating the situation. I was standing in my yard, minding my own business, and somehow I was now a threat to the community. The thought crossed my mind. I can't let her get away with this. I kept my phone in my pocket, hoping I wouldn't need to use it as a backup for later, but I was prepared. I had been keeping a mental log of all of her overreaching actions as HOA president, harassing neighbors, imposing rules no one agreed to, and overstepping boundaries. But this was next level. Within minutes, I could hear the familiar sound of sirens approaching. I couldn't believe it. Karen had actually called the police over a hat. It was absurd, but it was happening. The officers pulled up, and two of them stepped out of their squad cars. They were serious, scanning the neighborhood like they were about to handle a real emergency. I braced myself for what was coming. "Sir, what's going on here?" One of the officers, a tall man in his early 30s, asked as he approached me. I could tell he was trying to size up the situation. "I'm just wearing a hat," I said, keeping my tone calm. "But apparently, that's a problem for my neighbor, Karen." Karen, who had been standing off to the side, immediately began her rant. "This man is causing a disturbance," she said, throwing her hand toward me. "He's wearing a MAGA hat and making people uncomfortable. I feel unsafe." The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't immediately react. He turned to me, waiting for my side of the story. "Ma'am," I began, "I'm not making anyone uncomfortable. I'm simply enjoying my afternoon in my front yard. I'm not breaking any laws or causing any disruption. This is my personal property, and I have the right to wear what I choose." I saw Karen's eyes narrow. She was clearly not used to being questioned, especially not in front of the authorities. She stepped forward again, her face turning an even deeper shade of red. "This isn't about the hat," she said, her voice rising. "This is about the message he's sending to the community. He's political and divisive. It's causing chaos, and he needs to take it off. He can't just wear that around here." The officer looked back at her, and then back at me. I could tell he was trying to remain professional, but the absurdity of the situation was clearly beginning to register. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I don't see any violation of the law here. This is not something we can intervene with. People have the right to wear what they want, as long as they're not causing a disturbance." He turned to Karen and added, "If you feel threatened, there's nothing in this situation that warrants a police intervention. He's on his own property, and you're free to leave him to it." Karen's face twisted, her frustration palpable. She opened her mouth to protest, but the officer stopped her with a firm gesture. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to leave the area unless you have something more to report." The look on Karen's face was priceless. She was furious, but there was nothing she could do. The officers, firm but calm, weren't buying her story, and after a few more moments of her sputtering, she realized that she had lost. "I'm not done with this," she muttered under her breath, turning to storm off. "You haven't heard the last of this." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what she thought she could do next, but I wasn't worried. I had proof of her overreaction, and now I had her behavior on record. If she tried to escalate this again, I was ready. As the officers left, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The situation had been ridiculous, but I had stood my ground. I wasn't about to let someone bully me or control what I wore, especially not because of some political difference. And now Kara knew that I wasn't someone she could push around. The next few days were a roller coaster. After the police incident, I figured things would settle down, but Karen wasn't letting go of this easily. As soon as I thought she'd back off, I started hearing rumors from my neighbors. Karen had been spreading the story of how she had to call 911 because I was causing a disturbance in the neighborhood. She even claimed that I was unhinged and had become a threat to the community. The fact that she was spinning this narrative didn't surprise me. She had always been the type to twist things in her favor, but what caught me off guard was how many of my neighbors were believing her. I received a few concerned messages from people I hadn't spoken to much before, asking if I was okay and whether the situation was escalating. Some even questioned if I was making the neighborhood unsafe. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't just sit back anymore. I wasn't going to let Karen take the narrative and run with it. I couldn't risk letting people think I was the bad guy in this story. So I took action. I printed out a few facts: the police's official report from the incident, the neighborhood bylaws that protected my right to wear what I wanted, and a few testimonials from neighbors who had actually witnessed the situation. I created a small flyer, nothing too dramatic, but enough to get the truth out there. I decided to hand them out myself to make sure they didn't get misconstrued. I went door to door, talking to neighbors who had been concerned or confused by Karen's story. I explained what had really happened and showed them the proof. I told them how Karen had called 911 over something as simple as a hat, and how I had been within my rights to wear it. To my surprise, people were receptive. A lot of them didn't realize how far Karen had gone with her abusive tactics as HOA president. But there was one thing I couldn't shake. I still knew Karen wasn't going to back down quietly. In fact, she was more likely to come after me in some other way. She had made it clear that she was willing to go to extreme lengths to get me to comply with her views, and I had no intention of letting her get away with it. The next evening, I was out walking my dog when I saw Karen again. She was standing in her yard, watching me. At first, I tried to ignore her, but she quickly walked over to the sidewalk, blocking my path. "You think you've won, don't you?" she sneered. Her tone was dripping with malice. "You're just a troublemaker. People are talking about you now, and not in a good way. You can't keep getting away with this." I stopped in my tracks, facing her head on. "I'm not the one causing problems here, Karen. You're the one who called the cops over a hat. What kind of person does that?" She didn't have a response for a moment. But then she crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes at me. "You just wait," she said, her voice low and threatening. "I'm going to make sure the HOA knows about your little stunt. I won't let you get away with this." I didn't feel fear. I just felt a quiet resolve. I'd already made it clear to her that I wasn't going to back down. And now it was time for Karen's actions to finally have consequences. The next day, I attended the HOA meeting. I'd already spoken to a few neighbors who had my back, and I knew this would be the perfect chance to confront Karen and take the power away from her once and for all. I wasn't going to let her continue abusing her position. The HOA meeting was packed, more than usual. I could feel the tension in the air the moment I walked through the door. Karen was already at the front, standing behind her usual post, the HOA president's chair. Her poker face was on, calm but calculating, clearly preparing for the battle she thought was coming. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just going to fight her. I was going to expose her. As the meeting began, Karen wasted no time getting into her usual spiel about neighborhood improvements, most of which centered around things that nobody asked for. But today was different. Today, I had come prepared. When the floor was open for comments, I stood up, feeling the eyes of the room on me. Karen's gaze was sharp, but I wasn't intimidated. "Good evening, neighbors," I began, my voice steady. "I'm here today because we need to talk about something that's been going on in our neighborhood that some of you may not be aware of." I looked straight at Karen. "I'm talking about the situation where Karen, as our HOA president, called 911 on me because I was simply wearing a hat." The room went dead silent. Karen's eyes widened, and I could see her preparing to shut me down, but I wasn't about to back off. That's right. Karen called the police over a MAGA hat. I wasn't causing any disruption. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was simply exercising my right to wear what I choose. But Karen didn't like it, so she decided to escalate things. She called the cops, reported me for a non-existent crime, and made false accusations. I could feel the room shift. Neighbors who had been quietly listening started murmuring to each other. Karen was visibly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat, but I wasn't done. "I've gathered evidence," I continued. "I've recorded the 911 call. I have police reports showing that no violation occurred. And I've spoken to several neighbors who are tired of Karen's heavy-handed tactics as HOA president. The truth is, this isn't about my hat or the so-called disruption. This is about Karen abusing her position for personal gain and trying to control this neighborhood." I looked around the room, seeing several faces nodding in agreement. This wasn't just about my personal rights anymore. This was about holding Karen accountable for her actions and making sure no one else felt the same oppressive treatment. "Karen," I said, now directly addressing her, "you've abused your position, you've harassed neighbors, and you've tried to use the HOA as your own personal tool for power. It's time for you to step down." Karen's face was turning red, but I could see her faltering. She knew she was losing control of the situation. She stood up, her hands shaking with anger, but before she could say anything, the board president intervened. "Karen, please, let's keep this civil," he said, clearly trying to calm things down. "We'll review the matter and proceed accordingly." The room was filled with whispers, and I could feel the change in the atmosphere. For the first time, it was clear that Karen wasn't the only one calling the shots. The community was finally waking up to what had been happening behind closed doors. After a tense discussion, the board voted on the issue. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. The members of the board also agreed to implement new measures to prevent any one person from gaining that much power again. As I left the meeting, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Karen's reign of terror was over, and the neighborhood was finally free from her overreaching control. But more importantly, I had stood my ground and proven that one person could make a difference. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. Karen was out, and with her departure, the neighborhood slowly began to feel like a place of unity again. I never realized how much power one person could have, and how that power could turn toxic when left unchecked. But now things were changing, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. The new HOA board president, Julie, immediately started making positive changes. One of the first things she did was open up a community forum where residents could voice their opinions about the future of the neighborhood. No more hidden agendas. No more secretive decision-making. It was clear that the residents were now in control. In the weeks that followed, Karen's reputation in the community was thoroughly tarnished. Neighbors who had previously been intimidated by her now started speaking out. Some shared stories of how she had harassed them for petty violations, while others revealed how she had tried to use her position to sway real estate deals in her favor. The more people spoke, the clearer it became that Karen had been taking advantage of the HOA system for far too long. I never wanted to be involved in HOA politics, but after everything that had happened, I realized that it was important to stand up for what's right. Freedom of choice, personal rights, and community involvement were all things that needed to be protected, and I was ready to do whatever I could to keep things in check. One evening, while I was working on a DIY project in my garage, a few of my neighbors came by to talk. It was a bit of a tradition to catch up every now and then, but this time they had something interesting to discuss. "We've been talking," one of my neighbors, Mark, said, "and we all feel like you've been a real change in this neighborhood. Karen had this place on lockdown, but now we feel like we can actually have a voice." I smiled, grateful for the kind words. "It wasn't just me," I said. "It took all of us to make sure we didn't let one person dominate the neighborhood." We laughed and talked for a while longer, but it was clear that the dynamic had shifted. The neighborhood felt more connected than it had in years, and people were starting to believe that their voices mattered. As time passed, I heard less and less from Karen. She had become a shadow of her former self, no longer in control of the HOA or the community. The talk of her overreach and abusive behavior had completely changed the perception of her in the neighborhood. She was no longer the person who could simply walk into a room and dictate the rules. She had been held accountable. And as for me, I had learned a valuable lesson about standing up for what I believed in and never backing down, even when faced with intimidation or overreach. In the end, it wasn't just about wearing a MAGA hat or fighting back against Karen. It was about taking a stand for my rights and the rights of my neighbors. You can't let anyone dictate your life, and when enough people speak up, change happens. And that's how I stood up to Karen, exposed her abuse of power, and helped bring real change to our neighborhood. If you've ever had to deal with an overbearing Karen or had someone try to control your life, share your story in the comments. Like, subscribe, and comment below to let us know how you fought back. Thanks for watching, and remember, never let anyone push you around. Take control of your own life.